Hey there, Golden Bears. I hope you're keeping it classy, as I know you always do. Staying classy, keeping it classy. I thought I'd make a little video here to help you in preparing for the multiple choice component of Unit 2. Every one of these questions comes straight out of the textbook. So turn to the back of Chapter 2 and you'll find those there. I thought I'd just spend a few moments in reminding you that this is kind of the questions are designed that you have a prompt and that you're supposed to draw not a ton of time from them, but that they're requiring a stimulus and a response. And so what you're using is this stimulus question here to hopefully help remind yourself of what else was happening around that time period that you can draw from historically. So here we see Bernal Díaz del Castillo. And he isn't that significant, but by reading this description of him, hopefully you'll recognize that he's visiting the great city of Tenochtitlan. And a little backstory about him is that he was from Portugal, and he traveled with Hernán Cortés from Cuba into Mexico City and was one of the initial people who arrived and initial then to conquer. But what made him unique is that he then wrote his story and an accounts of what they experienced that went on to really greatly influence Spain's decision and Charles V's decision to join. So all that side knowledge that isn't crucial, but your job is to kind of be familiar with what is taking place here and use that to then ask yourself, well, this is the time period dealing with time period 1. Interestingly enough, okay, so, well, time period 1632, and we're talking 1607, if you remember when Jamestown was started, and by the time we get to 1630s, we're dealing with the expansion of more gold and silver coming out of Latin America or Mexico, modern-day Mexico, but also the trade taking place of sugar and the need for extraction of said items in order to keep the kings happy over there. So with that, just recognize a couple key things here I've highlighted for you. I would encourage you to read them on your own. But you notice he's talking about the skilled workmen there that Montezuma had, that they had definite crafts, that they had this amazing market that was bigger than any other market that they've ever seen, including Constantinople, which is modern-day Istanbul, to Rome, and that this was so laid out and orderly that it truly impressed them. And this gives us an idea of the depth and the breadth of the influence that the Aztec people had. But now, as we go through, remember, your job is to always look for the 2 false, bear in mind where's the distractor, and then from that, hopefully deduce the correct answer. So remember, 2 false, 1 distractor, and 1 answer that rules them all, if you will. So as we go through this, I'm going to encourage you to read this on your own. So you would stop the video right now, read the document in hand, do some maybe case study, a little bit of Bernal Castillo if you need to, and then dive in. So question number 1 is asking us, describe in the excerpt above an example of what are the following developments in the 1600s. Now look at this. We've talked about the religious and political leaders and how non-Europeans should be treated. That definitely was talked about when we discussed Sepulveda and his point of view, where Indians weren't even to be respected, to the opposite of De las Casas, who said they definitely had souls, etc. But is this really talking about that? How about the Columbian Exchange facilitating the European shift from feudalism to capitalism? Could be. Here I've gone through and I'm giving you kind of what I think are all the distractors as we go through this, and so I'm not going to go through and teach through every one of these aspects, but definitely do bear in mind of that. So the mutual misunderstandings of Europeans and Native Americans as a group sought to make sense of the other. In this time period early on in Aztecs, they weren't making sense of each other. They just knew quickly on they would be enemies. So here it seems true on the surface. This doesn't become true until later on, especially when we're talking about the colonists and their influence of this. And then this idea of the caste system by the Spaniards. This topic up here has nothing to do with, or this excerpt has nothing to do with that topic. So thinking of this, I'm going to be giving you the 2 first, kind of answers. This first one here is the Columbian Exchange facilitating the European shift from feudalism to capitalism. So, cool bears, with that number 1. Let's look at number 2 here, dealing with the same stimulus of the question above. It asks, the events described in the passage most directly foreshadowed. Foreshadowed, if you remember, is kind of like a movie trailer telling you what's going to happen up in front. Which of the following developments? So the Spanish attempts to convert native populations to Christianity. Okay, that did happen, but is the document above really most talking about that? The native people seeking to maintain their economic prosperity through diplomatic negotiation and military resistance. Did the excerpt have anything to do with diplomatic negotiations and military resistance? Maybe not. What I think is the distractor here, the Europeans and Americans' Indian adaptations of useful aspects of each other's culture. That is true because they are admiring one another's culture during this time, but it could certainly, it's not completely all there and true because the Europeans didn't really respect the Native American culture, if you will. And that leaves us to letter D, Spanish efforts to extract wealth from the New World. Hopefully, you'll see this is going to be foreshadowing why they see all these gold, these stones, and paintings and carvers, everything else definitely is a foreshadow of what? Letter D. Okay, that's the first 2 I gave you. The rest of these things I'm going to kind of recognize here or blast through. Here we have Nathaniel Bacon. You need to go look him up. This guy is really incredible in what he really typifies the first kind of revolutionary action 100 years before the revolution even takes place against the king. But what he's not revolutionizing or going against the king. He's upset because of the race relations, class relations, and definitely because the Native Americans are having their way with things, and he felt that the local government in Virginia was doing nothing to protect him. And so he brought up a bunch of people to kind of join his rebellion, if you will, and ultimately he died of dysentery, but this was a unique thing on, colonial soil back then. And so as you read through this excerpt, just ask yourself, what is he trying to declare? Is he trying to say that, King, we're not against you. In fact, we're for you. All we do is ask for some degree of support by the local colonial government in that. Well, let's see how this plays out. So letter D here is talking about this excerpt is best understood in the context of what? Well, how is this a distractor, the diverging goals and interests of European leaders and colonists? Well, could we say that they were diverging interests? No, because why? The colonists and the Europeans were there to do one thing, make money, and to continue to colonize to create more money for themselves. So this is why that would be distractor. The other things you're going to have to determine which ones are the false and which one is the true. Going on to this next question here, who of the following was most likely to have supported the perspective expressed in Bacon's declaration? Well, looking at this colonial representative assemblies, if you remember, he was frustrated at the colonial representative assemblies that were doing nothing to help them, namely the House of Virginia House of Burgesses, and this was just a frustration to him. Remember, he wasn't against the king. He wasn't asking for, this degree of seditious acts. He was just there to say, King, listen to us and please respond to our needs. Another excerpt here, I'm sorry that the screen will be split, but which of the following was an important consequence of the historical process discussed in this excerpt? And letter D here is an increasing attempt of British government to incorporate North American colonies into a coherent imperial structure in pursuit of mercantilist aims. Okay, this sounds really good, but this intent for imperial structure doesn't take place until later. If you don't remember the king and this idea of, I'm drawing a blank all of a sudden. When he abandons them, why can't I think of it? It's Sunday night at 8 or 6:30 or so, and salutary neglect. Thank you. Salutary neglect. That's been the policy, and so this is well before kind of that time period when Nathaniel Bacon is around, and that doesn't come until later. So this is why this would be a distractor. Going on to the other questions here. William Penn. Remember, Pennsylvania, a unique middle colony, religious colony. What were they about? And his city upon a hill, the governor elected 30 times. Be sure to do your research on him. He's a very important figure in the middle colonies and how they are so different from the northern colonies or the New England colonies and those in the South or the Chesapeake Bay. And here, I don't know why that blue line was there, but here you can see that these ideas of William Penn in this excerpt is most likely to reflect the influence of, and I think here it would be kind of logical to say because of the transatlantic print culture and the Enlightenment movement, but that is something that would kind of help influence William Penn. Well, that isn't true, because there are other things that William Penn is thinking about that is influencing how he looks at things during that time period. You have key things you need to look up. The Great Awakening, George Whitefield. You need to look at Finney. You need to look at the Methodist guy. I'm drawing a blank right now. But there were three key pastors here that emerged during this time period, with George Whitefield being probably the big kahuna of this First Great Awakening, where you have the Enlightenment theory being brought and introduced into the colonial societies. And what does this do? This awakening kind of begins to say, well, yeah, we see religion is important, but we also sense that there needs to be a science and a balance to this. And this is what really influences the New England colonies during that time. Oh, Jonathan Edwards is the other one that you should be mindful of. So letter D, the print culture, I think would be a distractor there during that question. Looking at this question here, that is expressed in the excerpt, contributed most to which of the following developments in colonial Pennsylvania? Well, please be mindful. I'm looking as if I put the wrong thing on the wrong thing. Well, I think I put D as on the wrong spot as I look at that. Let me look through the other possibilities. My apologies. I don't want to re-record this because of this. Violence, colonists, Americans, British government exert more direct control, influx of large number of European immigrants in the 1700s. I'm going to say stick with that. Letter B. It is a distractor. There were a large number of immigrants coming to them, but did that influence the idea expressed up above here? Okay, and choosing the people of that time period. Moving on to letter A. What was a characteristic of Pennsylvania? Well, homogeneous. Remember that they're all the same. And if you remember a lecture in class and in the columns that I gave you of the graphic organizer, there was definite unique things that you want to look up about the middle colonies during that time. So letter D is a distractor for you in that situation. Number 9, still dealing with the same stimulus, is the approach toward governing described in the excerpt was most similar to which of the following? If you remember that Virginia House of Burgesses, that was the first legislative body that the king allowed to help create laws and pass laws and to govern the colony. This was, in theory, the first democratic institution on American soil. And so there is very little connection between the House of Burgesses and what William Penn is designing there in Pennsylvania during that time. Well, now we get into this big transatlantic migration. Please, when you get to looking at these charts, you cannot, just state the obvious. You have to be looking around for everything here. So up here you see the transatlantic migration. That's the movement of people. Then we have two different time periods, the 1500s to 1640. So remember, 1607 is right here where Jamestown starts. So we're talking the Spanish here, and we're talking the little mocositos, the little boogers of America haven't begun to sprout just yet. It's over here that you begin seeing the colonial empire beginning to sprout with what's taking place in the Chesapeake region up in New England, and specifically what's taking down in Barbados and the West Indies. But so with that, notice here, Spain is the big player, whereas France is just a small number here. And as we look over this side, you see Britain really taking off, whereas Spain kind of remains constant. Portugal really expands down in Brazil. What is this? It's because cultivation of sugar or tobacco in the Americas and Barbados at the same time. Well, what is this chart asking? Well, as you read through it, and you hopefully read through the question on your own, please be mindful that the distractor here is the prompting agricultural settlement on the land taken from American Indians. I don't see anything there that is talking about the Native Americans at this point. So that would be a distractor. Although it is a definite concern, that isn't explicitly stated in that chart for you to kind of draw from. How about this one? How about the migration trends to the British colonies, depicted on this graph? So diminished colonial rivalry between Britain and France. That's another thing that, well, first of all, there was no diminished colonial rivalry. In fact, it was increased during this time between Britain and France because they're all vying for the waterways that take them from Canada all the way down to New Orleans and the ability to be doing trade. So that's a distractor. The long-term effects of migration trend in these graphs is explained by what? Letter D is a distractor. The French, Dutch, and Spanish colonies alliance with an arming of American Indian groups. Although true in a little bit later of this time period, that the chart doesn't have any reference point to that there for you to be mindful of. Okay, so here we have Benjamin Franklin. Please look up ideas and aspects of Ben Franklin and how his brilliance showed in how he helped govern, but also his ideas of the Richard Almanac. I mean, this document, this book was printed to almost, I believe, it's either 10,000 or 100,000 copies a year. In fact, it went all the way over to Europe where it was translated into French and Italian because it was such both informative but also a very fun read for people. And here, this story is talking about debt and how do we blend debt with our responsibility to our government and also responsibility before God. And so here we can see how does this poor Richard Almanac relate to various developments. And so here we need to look at the distractors. I believe it is that romantic beliefs in human perfectibility spreading in reaction to the Enlightenment. Well, these romantic beliefs have nothing to do with the Enlightenment. Okay, the Enlightenment is about science. Romantic is about just, a faith, so to speak. So that there is an incongruent thought, but it does sound good because, yes, the Enlightenment was influencing the Almanac. So remember, a distractor is almost half of it is like 3/4 could be true, half of it could be true. Don't be falling for those things and being duped on it. As we scroll through this question, we're looking for the most least likely to agree with this, and a Baptist minister here. Be mindful that you'd think a minister would be against any sort of economics and that of the church, but frankly, the Baptist minister is actually in favor of this. They believe in hard work ethic, these mindset of the Calvinistic philosophy of hard work, connecting with others. That is your way to yield the world unto your own self in order to extract, as being caretakers, so to speak, and how to extract the wealth from the earth to provide for you and your family. Moving on. The distractor here is that you would think when it says something about Indies have not made Spain rich because of her outgoes, meaning her outgoing monies versus what she's bringing in. You would think, since you see Spain, that this might be the answer, but this is the distractor, because nothing of what Richard Almanac is talking about is speaking to this encomienda system. This idea of making Spain rich because of her outgoes and greater than her incomes is a different economic principle that drives America during this time. So be sure you look up what those things are for that hint and clue that I give you. Oh, I can't even put the letter D there. Look at me, I'm late working on this type of thing. But his warning about debt and freedom most directly supports which of the following? That the colonists save their money for consumable goods. Well, if this is a distractor because it kind of goes counterintuitive to what debt and freedom is about. In order to go into debt, you usually go and maybe purchase things. So I don't want to give too much of away, but hopefully you will see how that could be a distractor on that. And lastly, John Winthrop, the governor of New England, one that helped start Harvard, and yes, did the City Upon a Hill and spoke about how religion and politics and our daily lives need to be intertwined. However, be mindful that in starting, he was a mathematician and philosopher, and I highlighted two things here. First, he has a parchment of letters that signify his studies. Here he has I think it's a telescope of sorts, signifying he's willing to look up at the stars to see stuff. You don't see a Bible here. Yes, you see him dressed in a cool black robe, but is that considered a garb for the college professor, or is that a garb for the governor, or is that a garb for a religious institution? So let us dive into this. So his position at Harvard suggests about changes in the 18th century in New England. A distractor is religion continued to be of prime importance to England elites. Well, in the Great Awakening, that probably began to split up. So go back and look up the Great Awakening and see how that influenced New England, but also especially John Winthrop and those who were wealthy at the time. And the last question, you're doing okay, is this idea of what characterized the best portrayal of John Winthrop in this image, and you have to look at letter B as the distractor, because there's really nothing up in this picture that has some sort of religious value or religious nature. So that I would call is a distractor. So other than that, good luck to you on this exam. I hope having these distractors at least gives you a greater chance of doing better on the exam, and gives you some ideas of how your brain should be wired in thinking for this. So until then, Bears, keep it classy, stay golden.